Okay, first of all, let me thank from the bottom of my heart, Jean-Michel, for providing this opportunity to meet you all and hearing such interesting presentations and papers, much more interesting than what I will deliver. And Jean-Michel is the really key of all of this, and I couldn't go on without thanking him very, very much. Okay, like I just, I'm afraid I will disappoint you a bit because I won't have much data to present. I'm rather only have to offer a somewhat dense theoretical program to try to make sense of football's fandom. And this is not an easy subject to address, at least in the Portuguese case, but I think it's not just the Portuguese case, for one basic reason. It's very hard to find, to have research funding. The scientific committees face football as a famous sociologist put it once, a pauvre objet, a bad object, a bad subject that you shouldn't invest yourself in because it's bad for your career. Well, there are the reasons, but this is a very important reason because in Portugal, it's really hard to have any project on football, whatever you can call the institution, fandom, whatever, to get it funded. Well, it's really, really hard. So to begin, I've done some research, but some 20, 25 years ago on football fandom of what I call football supporters cultures. And now we'll draw on some data that I collected back then concerning the Portuguese case. One central element is a strikingly unbalanced distribution of club preferences. 90% of the people that acknowledge having a club or following a club declare themselves following one of the three majors. So you're either from Benfica or Porto or Sporting, nothing else really matters much. And also the overwhelming male profile of supporters stood out back then. Not so much in terms of classes, because when you look at fans, at supporters through the lens of classes, social classes, well, it was amongst the highly educated middle classes, or if you want to put it, the petty bourgeoisie, that club allegiance appeared most strongly. So not working class. A working class practice or symbolic investment. Of course, 2 decades later, we have reasons to believe that things have changed quite a lot. For many reasons, television, of course, but the sense that you have to have money to access. You have then an economic filter. You have to have money to watch football on TV because it's quite expensive. The new stadiums, the design, the architecture of the new stadiums, which favors spectators seeking comfort and pushes away groups perceive les classes dangereuses, the social groups perceived as disruptive and dangerous, and then also the panopticism of the new arenas it is virtually impossible to escape the gaze of surveillance cameras. So, like Frank Parking would put it, the football matches that take place in these new arenas are venues of class closure through precisely exclusionary design. Again, one other point of discussion that I want to bring in: online forums for sports debate that are, at least in the Portuguese case, typically polarized around club identities. What is interesting, well, the context is very interesting, but there's a thing that really easily comes out is how competent you are in Portuguese. If you for some reason don't use proper grammar, or you make what errors of writing, you're bound to be accused of not being able to write Portuguese. So to make elementary mistakes. So what happens? People that with lower what you would say cultural capital are quite easily discouraged to participate. So it tends to be a thing of people with high levels of cultural capital. Well, so we observe at different levels and different domains quite significant and far-reaching transformations affecting both the institutions and the everyday lives, in the everyday, contexts in which supported identity is produced, and consequently in which supported experience itself is shaped. So my point is, how can we try to grasp what's going on? And that's what I will be talking about in a little while. But beforehand, let me introduce two examples what made me completely change the way I approach the fandom issues from back then in the 2000s, the first decade of this century. I'll bring in two examples, not not probably the better word to describe what these things are, mottos of evidence that I was facing. Let's go back to 2007. I was watching a match, second league match between Académica, a club from Coimbra, city in the middle of Portugal, and Leixões, which it's in the outskirts. It's a club from Matosinhos, which is in the outskirts of Porto. It was a Monday evening, a winter day, and looking at the stands traditionally occupied by the main supported groups of Académica, called Mancha Negra, or if you will in English, Black Patch, it was almost stripped of fans, almost empty, almost, because there were three guys there. And there's three young men there, and there's a lot to say about these three guys, because they were wearing pajamas. And they had their legs covered with blankets. And what's even more interesting, where were they sitting? They were sitting on a sofa. And I looked at that and said, how the hell did they get that couch into the stadium? Well, and beside the display, the banner, and the banner said, "Today we stayed at home." It was, of course, a protest. Football matches on Monday, etc., etc. After halftime, the fake deserters returned, but the banner was had changed. They displayed another banner saying, "We had enough. We had to come to the stadium." So, football fandom here literally as theatre and not, as in Goffman's, a metaphor for social playing. Second example. The Portuguese publisher, a man who was a supporter of Porto, a man who would become Secretary of State of Culture of a right-wing government, had a blog. But in 2010, he created a section within the blog, which he named the Hooligans Corner. Well, of course, what was the content of that section? It was basically what we would expect. It was Brazilian anthropologist studying sociabilities amongst men. He called it banter-based football relationships. Okay, so you scorn one another, you try to pick up, etc. The common thing. But of course, creating that corner with that name is like a kind of a keyword to deconstruct the content itself of that section. So it's kind of instructs the reader to read it with nonchalance. That's the proper way of consume the content of that section. So these two episodes, this evidence was extremely important to me. Of course, you can argue, and one should argue, that this phenomenon of sophistication and diversification of sports support is neither new or typically Portuguese. Well, Richard knows much more than me about it, but since the 1990s, sociologists and anthropologists of football in England had identified, tracing what are the social groups involved in this kind of commitment to good football fandom. Well, they even use a transformed notion developed by John Hurry, post-tourists, calling them post-supporters. And these guys are associated with petty bourgeoisie. They have a high level of cultural capital, much higher than economic capital in any way. They are employed mainly the new service sectors. They are educated. They have they dominate, if I can use the word, the new technologies. They enjoy very much consumption, but they are reluctant to view itself as a middle class. That's the way it was characterized. So this evidence, all these questions led me to bring myself to consider as deep as possible the space of football fandom as one of profound differences, but also one where such difference should be thought not only at the inter-individual framing, but also at the intra-individual framing. Well, so let's go finally to my proposal. Not before I say one thing. And now I criticize Richard, but I distance myself from the proposal that he brought back yesterday on the typology of the possibilities of the figures, the main figures of sports, of football fandom. Because this is a very interesting way to construct typologies or taxonomies. Call it what you will. it's a very interesting case to see the effects of the impacts of the hyper-commodification of football on spectators. It's very interesting because it merges or combines principle of ordinal differentiation with principles of normal differentiation. But I won't be going back. I was thinking about saying, but we all recall what Richard presented yesterday. But my point is that typological analysis of this kind, to me, it's not entirely satisfactory. Because if they, of course, distance themselves from the risk of what a Brazilian historian defines as reducing the support to the condition of a tabula rasa, pathological derivative of the emotions offered by the Aristotelian metrics of theatrical catharsis. This is the words of Buarque de Holanda, an historian. I think that they still risk embracing a conception of the social actor as unified and continuous across social spaces and through time. And this, as I think we now have strong indications, severely limits the possibility of fully understanding and seizing the complexity of fan condition everywhere, but specifically in Portugal, because it's the case that I have been studying for more than 25 years. So, if we acknowledge this limitation, what is the argument that pushes us forwards? My argument is that in order to give a proper account of space of the fan space condition, and so to answer the rather fuzzy question, who are the ordinary supporters, it is necessary to merge on the one hand, and what I call an anthropology of acting subjects or social actors, attentive to process of individualization, of subjectivation, and dispositional diversity on the one hand, and on the other hand, a sociology of regimes of action, the moral grammars that converge in football as they do in other objects of public life and controversy. This dual approach advances a central hypothesis that, and what is that central hypothesis? That the domain of club commitment can and should be taken as an arena in which we observe social processes characteristic of contemporary societies, including the very fabric of individuals, the forms through which the outrage and resentment are expressed and compromises are reached, the production of recognition and its moral templates. And besides the central hypothesis, a key idea, that of heterogeneity. And here I follow mostly Bernard Lahey's sociology, dispositional sociology. And following that sociology, I face face is not the right word. I gather that individuals affiliated with football clubs are constituted by plural and often mutually incompatible repertoires of football fandom-related inclinations or dispositions. On the other hand, concerning this idea of heterogeneity, supports a unique character building does not correspond to a single practice or an autonomous logic. Rather, it draws upon different grammars of action and economies of social words. And I here base myself on what became to be known as sociologie pragmatique, pragmatic sociology as developed by Luc Boltanski and Laurent Thévenot. Well, this proposal is not entirely new. If you go back to Bromberger, the same, not so much the idea of heterogeneity. I'm dyslexic. Sorry about this word. But the moral bonds of football fandom is studied how much?
It's we need to finish normally now. So
okay, so I'll go. I'll finish. I'll go over Bromberger's proposal, but the moral link of football fandom is very well. It was really the study of this moral link was very well inaugurated by Bromberger's studies, following a man which is an ethnologist, but also psychiatric, a psychanalyst, Alain Ehrenberg. Some of you may have heard of him. He worked on football subjects also, but so it's not really new. So to end up and to resume what I've been saying. So the fundamental approach that I'm proposing articulates, on the one hand, the plurality of regimes of action, which many supporters will engage with to varying degrees and differing nuances in the concrete situations of everyday life, where supporter life is pragmatically enacted on the one hand, and on the other hand, processes central to supporter subjectivity construction, namely the dual swaying between love and justice, or to put it in more theoretical terms, between agape regime, which is immune to justification, and the justificatory regimes that demand it, and the intersection of two well-known moral grammars that we should also consider studied for other masters by French-based yet Argentinian sociologist called Danilo Martuscelli. The moral grammars, which he called the objective injustice and of subjective vexation. Social actors are fully capable of mobilizing the regime of action appropriate to the concrete situations in which they are engaged, using it in operations of judgment and in modes of qualifying the beings and objects that immediately inhabit their action horizon. In other words, in particularly simplified terms, the formation of the social space of supporters' condition also includes a supporter-oriented economy of worth, to which no ordinary supporter is entirely impervious. From the methodological point of view, the first thing we have to do is mapping these moral grammars. The next step is to give sociological meaning to supporter experience based on the notion of heterogeneous dispositional patrimony. It should be finally emphasized that this operation necessarily involves articulating these socialized repertoires of action with the positions that the actors occupy within the social class fields. thereby shaping socialization process that are themselves more or less plural and resulting in more or less coherent and close dispositional structures and I can finish like that are more or less coherent and closed in dispositional structures. That's all for you today. Sorry, it's